So today we'll be exploring Western migratory monarch conservation in Marin, Mendocino, and Sonoma County coastal areas. We're very excited to welcome our three expert speakers, Mia Monroe, who's the co-founder and volunteer coordinator of the annual Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count, Emma Pelton, who's the senior endangered species conservation biologist with the Xerces Society, and Dr. Stu Weiss, co-founder and chief scientist of Creekside Center for Earth Observation. And before I introduce our first presenter, I want to go over the agenda and a few housekeeping items for today. So once we finish up with the introduction, we'll go into presentations. Mia will speak first, followed by Emma Pelton, and then we'll wrap up with Dr. Stu Weiss. The question and answer period will follow the conclusion of all three presentations, so we'll have a good amount of time for questions at the end of the webinar. I encourage you to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions throughout each presentation. And if you have a question for one speaker in particular, please feel free to include their name in that question. When the Q&A wraps up, we'll say our goodbyes, but I do want to mention up front that upon exiting the webinar, an evaluation form will pop up on your screen. And so if you have a few minutes to fill that out, we would greatly appreciate any feedback that you can provide us on our webinar. And there's also some additional demographic information so that we can better understand who's attending our webinars and who we are reaching. These evaluations really help us, so thank you in advance to anyone who does complete that form. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can welcome our first presenter, Mia Monroe.
Hello, my name is Mia Monroe. I'm a volunteer with the Xerces Society, and I'm very excited to be here at this auspicious time when we're welcoming monarchs back to California coastal areas. And I've been involved with monarchs for nearly 40 years. And a scene like this, even though taken in Mexico, is what I did often see when visiting other sites up and down the California coast. So welcome to those of you who are excited about monarchs, and may our wishes come true. May monarchs return. Can we gather at events like I'll be showing you in my slideshow? And can you all participate in one way or another in monitoring, as well as we're going to touch on some of the site improvements that are giving further hope. Before we go on, I would like to share thanks with a few people here. Rebecca Burkhoff of the Presidio Trust is possibly on this call, and she is one of the highlights of this presentation. So thank you, Rebecca, for sharing some of these images. Like all of you on this call, the Western Monarch Count has been built on the educational efforts, the research, the volunteers of many, many different people. And I'm going to go through a few legendary figures with you here who have really helped inform what we're doing. And now to welcome you to what monitoring monarch style along the California coast is like. People like you and me are out there looking again, looking some more. It's hard to find the monarchs. They're up there. When they're hanging, they look like dead leaves. There aren't too many, and so we're spending a lot of time looking. Now, what's really exciting about being a monitor these days is there's lots of great tools out there, and one of them is the volunteer training videos that are on the westernmonarchcount.org Xerces website. And we really encourage you to start your homework right now. Go online, begin the training, go out and start looking for monarchs on the wing, familiarize yourself with the different sites, and start getting the site image for what monarchs on the wing, hanging, sunning looks like. And then you'll be ready to step up as a volunteer in the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count. And this count is underway soon, starting in mid-November. Now, we used to do things the old-fashioned way, written data sheets mailed in, and we still kind of have clipboards in hand so we can keep track of where the monarchs are at the cluster sites. We can compare our data, but we've gone modern. We're at count 1, 2, 3 this year, and it all goes in electronically so ISIS can help us keep track. note things, audit, suggest additional counts, etc. Now, what happens to this data? Lots and lots of exciting things. First of all, it's indispensable. The data that we collect as monitors, it helps inform Xerces on what the population size is, what the trends are. It's fed to researchers. It goes into documents like this. It's picked up by media, and it helps us feel like we're part of a huge effort called community science. People like us, volunteers, who use protocol to find the monarchs, to count, to enter data, to cross-check, etc. So we are part of a big effort called community science, and it gets to work and put into all different kinds of tools to help people out. Now we're going to go on a little adventure here. You can see us on the Presidio heading out for a day of monitoring. Here we are, like I said, looking and looking and looking. We're helping people understand what a microclimate is like, what the configuration of the grove that favors monarchs is, how to use binoculars. We have a lot of training going on in this session. Here we are at the edge of a golf course, another favored place often for monarch butterflies. We're looking, we've arrived early. You can see it's kind of chilly, so that the monarchs are still in the cluster and we can make a good count. We're looking for early flyers to possibly give away where they are. And this is what I want you to be doing now. I want you to be cruising around looking for flyers. It's often a clue of where the clusters are. Get used to your site, learn where to park, ask people if they've seen monarchs yet. So those of you who are out there interested in being a count monitor, now's the time to start looking around, practicing with those training videos and seeing what the lay of the land is from a monarch viewpoint. Now, it only starts there, getting out in the field, practicing your skills, looking up in the trees. You also want to have your smartphone all loaded with iNat so that if you see monarchs, you can start entering data in. ISIS, we also said that we're collecting data early, so it's fine to send in your observations to Xerces on the Save Western Monarchs or the Western Monarch Count page so that we can build a good database. Now, you may want to take your camera along. It's beautiful being at overwintering sites, watching the monarchs take flight, watching them nectar or sun. Now, at the Presidio, they wanted to come up with some creative ways because I want to see a monarch is the first question, but the second one is, what can I do to help? So they wanted to take the Western Monarch Action Plan. It's a 5-step plan, and they wanted to give people creative, meaningful ways that we can each help. So there were some displays up there that had been created by the science lab there. And one of them is, I will post my monarch photos to iNaturalist. So we wanted to encourage everyone to step up as a community scientist. You may choose to take that big step as a Western Monarch Count monitor, but it takes a lot of time. You have to be available to scout things out. You have to make at least one visit during the count period. You have to watch those training videos. You have to download the app. You have to enter the data. All good, important things to do if you want to be a count monitor. But everyone can participate as a community scientist by loading iNat up and entering data there. And it also helps us monitors because we cruise both iNat and Nextdoor to see where monarchs are being seen to help us focus, especially when the numbers are really low. All these are really important tools to help us not miss a single monarch. Okay, do we count this one or not? This is Jane Kim's amazing mural in downtown San Francisco. Let you see what you think of that suggestion. And here, this is one of the ways that I train volunteers. I have lots of images like this. I have umbrellas with monarchs. I have photographs with monarchs, so we can all practice counting. We can you should always go out with a buddy. We can both count and then compare. We can figure out how to refine our counting techniques. So take a look, start practicing counting. Gosh, you can count birds on the trees. You can count books on the shelf. Practice your counting skills. Now, this is a public event. Monarch observers and monitors are intrepid. We had the date. We wanted to go out. We wanted to learn. But your count should not be done on a rainy day. You need to wait for a good weather day. But these are intrepid, and because they are signing up as community scientists to walk through this area regularly and record through INAT, they wanted to know where the site was, and they wanted the tips, and they wanted to practice using their binoculars. They wanted to look at where we had seen monarchs in the past, which is a really good tip. I always go back to where I've seen them in the past. Maybe they'll be there again. But if you're a monitor, go out in clear, nice weather. If you're out cruising and looking, go out after a storm and see where maybe a monarch is warming up on the ground. Go out during the day and see where they're nectaring. All this is important information. And I know I'm giving you several things. One is to be a community scientist and be out there observing. Help us build the database of what plants monarchs nectar on. Help us understand how far they go to sun or to nectar. But if you're a monitor, there's protocol. It tells you when you should do your count, which period of time, which is in November 17th through December 5th this year. It tells you what time of day, early, so that you can count the monarchs in the clusters. There's other things that you'll learn in those training videos. Here we are observing and looking around at the important site at Robb Hill. And our data goes into these difficult graphs that show us the trends as well as the rapid decline. And I always tell volunteers that the good news about these graphs is that blue line. It's going up and up. That's us, more and more of us volunteering. Now, when you're out there, as I mentioned, everyone's going to want to see a monarch, but they're also going to want to know what to do to help. So you are an amazing ambassador for monarchs. You help share what the role of milkweed is and where to plant it, and more importantly, where not to plant it. You let people know how important native milkweeds are and resources on how to learn what milkweed is native to your area, and again, what to plant, what not to plant. If you're in a coastal area, which I think many of the people on this webinar are, the answer is milkweed is critical and important, but do not plant it near the coast. You can refer instead to the other very important thing, the nectar plants, so that monarchs can stay robust and have enough fat to make it through the winter. Again, all these links are available on the Xerces website. So just pointing them to xerces.org or savewesternmonarchs.org helps get these links to all the people who want to know what to do next. Here's this summed up, and I'm sure Isis is going to put this in the chat too. Now I want to introduce you to the gentleman. He's going to speak in a little bit after Emma. That's Stu Weiss on the right. And one reason we chose this field trip is because Stu Weiss is part of the Presidio Trust and National Park Service team to help come up with a prescription on how to enhance the overwintering sites. A lot of them are deteriorating or no longer have the values that hold monarch butterflies. And as a monitor, that's one of the things that you help us do, is contribute to a habitat assessment to guide work of people like Stu. And this is the hopeful message I want to leave you with, because not only are we seeing monarchs this year, and you're stepping up in one way or another as a community science monitor, but also there are people like Stu and others who are helping improve the sites. And thanks to Xerces for offering this opportunity to share one of the more rewarding things that I've experienced over my 40 years is being a monitor and contributing to this Western Monarch Count. I hope to see you out there in the field, and I'm glad to be part of this team. Thank you, Isis.
Thank you so much, Mia. If you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, that's great. That was a wonderful presentation. Thanks for the loads of encouragement. To everyone in the audience, I hope you saw the links that I put in the chat for some of the resources that Mia mentioned in her presentation. And I'd also like to remind everyone to ask your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Again, we'll be going through those at the conclusion of all three presentations. All right, so now we'll hear from Emma Pelton, Senior Endangered Species Conservation Biologist with the Xerces Society and our Monarch lead. Thanks for being here with us, Emma. I'll pass it off to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Talking about overwintering monarchs is one of my favorite topics. So welcome and thanks for inviting me, Isis. I'll be talking a little bit more broadly about Western monarchs and getting into some of the big picture reasons that we think we're in trouble and how we can help. Mia really touched on a lot, so I'll be kind of reinforcing some of her great points. So just to zoom out, you may be familiar with this map, but if you're not, this is a picture of what we think of the two populations of monarch butterflies that are migratory in North America. And they are the Eastern monarch butterfly population, which breeds east of the Rocky Mountains, and then the Western population that we're all interacting with, which breeds west of the Rocky Mountains. And just want to point out that that red along the Pacific coast in California represents these overwintering sites we've been talking about, and they stretch into Mendocino County all the way down into Baja. And we also know from some great tagging work, largely by community scientists from the Southwest Monarch study down in Arizona, that at least some portion of our monarchs in the Southwest travel down to Michoacan, Mexico, and mix with those Eastern monarchs that have gone down there to overwinter. So the Western population has two places they overwinter. And we're not sure the full proportion that go to Mexico versus go to the West Coast, but we do know a lot of our butterflies, specifically any monarchs that have been tagged in the Pacific Northwest or in California, always end up along the Pacific coast around this time of year. And monarchs have this big, amazing migratory story, and so they need different things along different parts of their journey. When they're breeding and they're migratory, which is happening anywhere from March through September, October, they're mostly looking for milkweed in that spring and summer portion where milkweed is the only plant that the caterpillars can use to eat and develop into adults successfully. They're mostly all in the Asclepias genus, but there are a few other genera mostly found kind of in the deserts of California that are not Asclepias, that are milk vine and things like that. But primarily they're using milkweed, they're using Asclepias species to eat. And it's very much a story of the very hungry caterpillar where they grow multiple times and shed their skin, and they go through five stages as caterpillars before they emerge as adults after pupating. When they're adults, though, they're very much generalists. They don't just need milkweed. They can use a wide range of flowers that provide nectar. So there are many native and non-native species they will use to get fuel, as Mia said, to keep up their energy for that long migration, that long overwintering period. But about this time of year, they're more focused on overwintering than anything else. And so they just need to get through winter conditions, and they're looking for forested groves and we think nectar. And then I like to also point out that we have evidence that pesticides can be a real detriment to their populations, along with many other beneficial insects like bees and butterflies. So we really need to think about making sure that their habitat is as free from pesticides as it can be. That breeding habitat, we like to think, kind of shake up what people might think of as what breeding habitat is. Monarchs and milkweeds can be found really in our arid areas and our wet areas. And there's at least one milkweed that's adapted to pretty much most habitats. Besides, if you get really far up in the Pacific Northwest, kind of north of me, I'm in Portland, Oregon, we've got a little bit more limited milkweed up here. But otherwise, most parts of the West, most habitat types, until you get to really high elevations, contain at least one species of milkweed. And then for that overwintering, they're looking for a totally different and very specific set of conditions. This is a generic shot of the Central Coast, but it's a good example of kind of some of the classic places that monarchs overwinter. Up by you all, the North Coast, it looks a little bit different. And you can see from this map that Mendocino, Marin, and Sonoma are really kind of the upper edge of that range of where they're found. And I zoomed in here. I pulled from our database that we have 34 sites in Marin that monarchs have ever been reported clustering in the winter. 11 of those sites are monitored by volunteers, including Mia and probably some of you. Sonoma County, we know of 20 sites, 6 are regularly monitored, and in Mendocino, 6 sites with 3 regularly monitored. So we would love to see more of these monitored. We definitely think that some of those sites probably aren't monitored because the habitat may no longer be supportive of monarchs. So that's some of the reason. But there are many other kind of mystery sites where people just haven't gone back, or with the numbers being relatively low, it's a little harder to get people out to look at sites that haven't hosted monarchs in a long time. But we have some open questions and some interest, especially with a warming climate, where we think potentially monarchs are going to use our northern sites a little bit more than they may have in the past. So it's an area of active interest and active research, and why we're excited that you're all here. So just wanting to touch briefly on the Western monarch population status. As Mia said, most of what we know about how many Western monarchs there are in terms of migratory monarchs is counting them. It's really convenient for us that they all count, or that they cluster, and then we can count them or estimate them along the coast. So that's really the Thanksgiving count that Mia was explaining. Mia, I think, is very humble, as she's one of the founders, along with Dennis and David, who she had photos of. And so really we're celebrating the 25th year, and it couldn't be possible without Mia. And I think Isis and I both, who manage it on Xerces side, are just really grateful for her continued involvement, along with many other people that devote a ton of time every single year. This is actually a picture of one of our coordinators, Karis Vanderheide, who recently moved to another country and has still been dedicated to fly back to do the counts. So that's my maybe most extreme example of someone showing up to do the counts, but I think it really gets in people's blood, and they get excited, and they keep coming back. So thank you for all of you that are on here that already count. And if you're interested in getting involved, there are definitely certain sites we can still use help for. So thank you. And we've got that address for the website if you want to learn more and start to take up some of those training materials Mia mentioned. And using that incredible community science data, we can construct really fun and depressing graphs. So Mia showed a few. This is a modeled population, and if you're not a graph person, don't worry about it. The big takeaway is, as Mia said, we've had over a 99.9% decline in the number of butterflies overwintering since the 1980s. From past estimates, there were millions of butterflies. In the late 90s, the population crashed, it briefly rebounded, and then it kind of hit a new lull with hundreds of thousands of butterflies. And then in 2018, we saw a crash below what we think is a really important threshold for the population of 30,000 butterflies. So we had 2 years where we were just below 30,000. And then last year we had less than 2,000 butterflies, which was really disturbing. This year, we don't have the numbers yet. The count is about to begin in about 2 weeks, but early numbers suggest, I think we're going to get back up to about that threshold, if not a little bit above. So that's a little bit hopeful. I don't think we're going to get back up to the numbers we saw pre-crash, but we are having some hopeful reports this year, including at Pismo Beach and an adjacent site. We just heard between yesterday and today that about 20,000 butterflies were counted, which is incredible. So those 2 sites alone, which do tend to be some of our bigger sites, already kind of get us back up to that threshold. But we would like to see them much above that threshold, and that's probably really critical for the long-term survival of the population. And we'll talk a little bit more, but I think we also would love to hear from all of you about what you're seeing at your sites. And we have not seen those high numbers in our Bay Area sites, in our North Coast sites, or in our Santa Cruz sites. So most of the big numbers have really come from the Central Coast. So it'll be interesting to see if butterflies are still arriving and maybe what the patterns are. But right now, a lot of those big numbers are really Central Coast. So I do want to take a brief moment. Xerces is not a regulator, we're a nonprofit, but do want to just share because a lot of people have questions about the legal status. So right now, the monarch is a candidate species under the Federal Endangered Species Act. This means it's not currently listed as threatened or endangered, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that's in charge of making these designations, has said that it does warrant protection, but they have higher priorities right now. We've got a big work backlog. So they anticipate listing the species So that will include both Western monarchs and Eastern monarchs in 2024. And there's been some work by legislators and others to try and move that timeline up. But right now there's an anticipation that in about 3 years, we'll have these, the butterfly listed. There's a lot of efforts right now to work on the recovery, both to prevent listing in some cases and also because we want to see that population rebound and not need listing. On a state level, whether or not the state of California can list monarchs under their Endangered Species Act is currently in the courts, specifically around a bumblebee issue, but that's kind of a legal sticky widget that's underway. So right now there's not state protection for monarchs in that way, but the state has required, and I put a screenshot of their website if you want to learn more. This is something that's been on the books for a while, but hasn't been well understood or well known. And the state is being more, is communicating more about this, especially with the low numbers last year. So right now, to do anything really with monarchs that involves touching them, you need a scientific collection permit through the state. So you have to apply and wait, and it takes quite a while. And they currently have a moratorium. So if you wanted to, let's say, sample monarchs to kill them for a study, that wouldn't be allowed because of the low numbers. But if you wanted to do something like tagging, that would probably be allowed. You just have to get a permit. So this is shaking some people up. We just want to let people know you can reach out to the state, to CDFW if you have questions or concerns. But right now, this does mean that it's technically against the rules to captive rear, and that even means putting mesh cages over plants, which I think was something that a lot of people didn't know. And so that's just something to be aware of. And hopefully if numbers go back up, there can be maybe an increase in people's ability to do more hands-on research. But right now they're being really careful because they're really concerned with how small the population is. So how did we get here? Why are monarchs declining? Like so many wildlife species, we don't necessarily have one thing that we can say, yes, this was the cause. So it's really common that you have a few different things that probably interact. And people might debate exactly which thing was more or less important that led us to this crash. But overall, the big players we think are a loss and degradation of the overwintering habitat, the loss of their breeding and migratory habitat, just as we have development and pesticide use that have taken out a lot of native plants and milkweeds in our landscapes, both our agricultural landscapes and our urban landscapes. Pesticide use, herbicides, which kill plants like milkweed and nectar plants, and insecticides, which are often applied not to prevent monarchs from, eating your roses or, attacking a food crop, but there's a lot of movement of pesticides in the environment and much more than I think people used to think. And there's been some really good work from the University of Nevada, Reno, in partnership with Xerces to test milkweed plants in California. And we found really disturbing problematic levels of pesticides in all of the milkweed samples that we tested, including national wildlife refuges, organic farms, people's homes where they weren't using pesticides just because of the movement of these chemicals in our environments. We think climate change is probably making things harder for monarchs and for many other species. More extreme winter storms, more extreme wildfires can really make things harder. But we do think that if we can tackle some of the habitat pieces and the pesticide pieces, we can create a much more resilient population that will do better under future climate change scenarios. And there could be other factors that play a role, but these are some of the main ones. So how can you help? I think some of the big pieces Mia really touched on. I kind of have a quick recap list here. If you have any engagement with overwintering sites, we think that's a really critical part of the conservation and the recovery of this population. You can plant native milkweed, and I'll give a few caveats about that on the next slide. Replacing that non-native tropical milkweed Mia mentioned with native milkweed and nectar. If you have habitat on your property or at a park and there is already milkweed, it's so much easier to try and protect and manage habitat that's already there than create it from scratch. If you're working on other habitat projects because you're a land manager or you're restoring a stream, thinking about how you could incorporate native milkweed and nectar plants, I think is a really nice way to fit that in and have that lens for any work we're doing with restoration. Try to reduce or eliminate pesticides, particularly insecticides. We value that certain herbicides can be really helpful tools to jumpstart certain restoration projects. So if that's something that you need to do, thinking about doing that in a way that minimizes harm to monarchs and other pollinators is really important. participate in community science, and then as Mia, I think put so well, educate and communicate. You can be an ambassador in your community. But when we think about planting native milkweed, we really want to think about, I stole this from you, Mia, right plant in the right place. So most native milkweeds don't grow close to the Pacific coast in Northern and Central California. They do grow close to the East Bay. So I just want to put that out there if there's any East Bay folks, that we do see native milkweed in the East Bay. But for the Pacific coast, they typically don't grow really close. So I pulled this from Calscape. Calscape is a great tool if you don't use it. You can look up a native plants range, or you can just put in like your address or your zip code, and it'll tell you what plants are native to your specific area. It's a really nice tool. This is an example of one of those most common milkweeds, narrowleaf milkweed. So the yellow is the range of that plant. You'll just see that a lot of our coastal areas really don't within the native range of that plant. So we don't want to be telling people to plant plants where they don't naturally occur. This is how we came up with a 5-mile rule of thumb. If you need a really simple answer, people say, can I plant milkweed or not? For the whole coast of California, north of Santa Barbara, we say about 5 miles, but that's a rough estimate. And we definitely say that you should check in for your local area. You can see some exceptions. If you're down by Timber Cove or Jenner, there's a population and there's a range that's much closer than 5 miles from the coast. So using what's most appropriate for your area trumps that 5-mile rule, but we use the 5-mile rule as a helpful kind of benchmark for people. So talk to your local California Native Plant Society chapter or local botanist if you want to learn more, and recognize that rule is there to be a guide and isn't a firm line in the sand. And then finally, we get a lot of interest in the resident monarch phenomenon because a lot of monarchs, people might see monarchs that aren't clustering, but they are on tropical milkweed and they might still have caterpillars this time of year or much later. This has long been a phenomenon in Southern California due to their warm winters, but more recently we're finding it in the Bay Area, specifically the East Bay last winter. And so if you have tropical milkweed, you may still see butterflies that aren't clustering throughout the winter. And whether or not this is a good thing is an area of active research. Generally though, from what we know, we think this could be really a concern because this plant has been so widespread planted and monarchs really like it. The problem is that it's not native and it doesn't die back. And we need those plants to die back to help monarchs get the cues to make it to the overwintering sites instead of continuing to hang out and breed and lay eggs. If they do that, those eggs tend to be heavily infested with a protozoan parasite, which is known by its short name of OE. And there's been great work by Francis Villablanca and others that have shown that there are 10 times the rate of OE on winter breeding monarchs that there should be if they were at the overwintering sites. And if these protozoan parasite loads get high enough, it'll kill larvae, it'll make them bad flyers, it'll make them have shorter lives. So there's a lot of negative effects of that in spreading disease in the population. It also encourages them to not continue to their overwintering sites. And so under a changing climate with warmer falls, we think that this could be a more prevalent phenomenon. And there's going to be a study starting this spring and late winter by Elizabeth Crone and Cheryl Schultz, who have a great piece if you want to really dive into it. They gave kind of an opinion piece with a quick study last year, and now they're going to dive into it more deeply. So hopefully we'll have better guidance in the future. Right now, we really want to say plant native milkweed. And if you have tropical, this is a great time to cut it down to the ground to make it act like native milkweed and break that disease cycle. And finally, just make a plug for, again, community science. If you want to go kind of the hardcore route, like Mia mentioned, you can become a Thanksgiving Count volunteer, but we're going to put you through some hoops. You're going to have to watch some training videos. You're going to have to go out with people in person. Thankfully with COVID, we can still distance and do things outdoors for the most part. But if you want to get into this, you can also look on our website. We have an interactive map so you can see if there are sites in your area. You can download Thanksgiving Count data and you can look at studies. You can just generally nerd out about all things Western Monarch overwintering sites. But if you are maybe more of a casual observer, as mentioned by Mia, and this is something we encourage for people, like any time of year, anywhere in the West, you can report monarch or a milkweed. We have a project in iNaturalist. So I love iNaturalist. It's a great app. It's a great tool. And you can use it, for many other species besides monarchs. But if you get that on your phone, either Android or iPhone, get that app, and then you tag the Western Monarch Milkweed Project Mapper project. That makes sure we get it. If you don't tag our project, we might get it. We just have to dig a little bit, and sometimes certain records kind of fall out because we have relatively high standards of what we take. But take a photo with your phone. If you don't have a phone, take a camera, and then you can upload it to our website. And we really love that data. We have over 50,000 records, thanks to all of you. And it makes us have these cool maps like this one. I just pulled this yesterday. This is a screenshot of kind of the North Coast area. You can see all of those orange dots are adult butterflies, the purple dots are caterpillars or eggs, and the green dots are milkweed. And finally, as Mia said, we have a lot of different resources on our websites. A lot of them we've created in partnership with RCDs, with NRCS, with Monarch Joint Venture. There are a lot of great regional monarch working groups like the Marin working group. So a lot of great resources. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to us if you're not sure where to find something. So with that, thank you, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was wonderful. I'm just going to put in the chat where you can find the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. Everyone. Okay, and now I'd like to welcome our final speaker, Dr. Stu Weiss. Thanks for being here, Stu. Stu is the chief scientist and co-founder of Creekside Center for Earth Observation. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, hi, thanks. I'm really going to dive into how do we assess and manage overwintering sites. And we're using some relatively high-tech methods, LIDAR, that's the laser, and the fisheye camera, hemispherical photography. I'm just going to dive in to some of the work we've been doing in Sonoma County under a Wildlife Conservation Board grant to the local RCD, Goldridge RCD. So we need to first understand what are monarchs looking for? What's their microclimate preferences? So first thing is to be in a place that rarely freezes, which means you're on the immediate coast or shores of San Francisco Bay. The monarch is a tropical butterfly, basically, so very intolerant of freezing. But then it can't be too warm, otherwise they burn up their fat reserves over the winter and can't re-migrate out. Very, very important is protection from the wind. Kingston Leong had established that if the wind is greater than 2 meters per second at ground level, monarch, which is about 5 miles per hour, the monarchs will leave that site. They also need direct sunlight. They want sufficient, but not too much direct sunlight. And that allows them to bask and take flight and cool temperatures, but also lets them kind of hunker down in dappled light environments or even deep shade. And the important thing is that they have options in heterogeneous habitats, because the pattern of monarchs in an overwintering site is, I call it crowdsourcing the microclimate. Each monarch is making decisions based on whether it's comfortable or not. If it's not comfortable, they take flight. When it's time to land again, they look for where all the other monarchs are, because that's a good indication it's the best place to be a monarch. So you see this movement of monarch clusters over the course of the day, over the course of weeks, in response to weather conditions. Now, the principles of monarch site management include, we need them to be resiliency. So we need a range of conditions that buffer environmental variability. We want redundancy, so that the loss of a single branch or tree or other habitat feature doesn't compromise habitat integrity. Good example of this would be having 2 versus 1 row of trees in a wind shelter belt. we have to realize that forests are dynamic. They change through time. Trees die, they grow, branches fall. It's not a museum piece that can be held in a static condition. Sometimes this really gets lost on people who are trying to do well for the monarchs. And we need to have proactive adaptive management where the changes are anticipated well in advance and that the management's carried out at a deliberate and measured pace. Basically, it only takes a minute for a tree to fall, but it takes decades to grow a tree back. So we need to anticipate those. And then lastly, when you're making decisions about how to manage a grove and undertaking those, it's really important that this be done in the field with the people doing the work, whether it's contractors doing forestry, because we've all seen in this business, you come up with a recommendation and it's not implemented correctly. So these California sites, as Emma and Mia have shown, stretch from Mendocino down to Baja. This photograph of monarchs is from Elwood, Maine in Santa Barbara County, when there were tens of thousands of butterflies there. I have had the honor and privilege and responsibility of working at numerous sites since 1990. Southern California, Central Coast, a lot of Bay Area sites. I'm not going to run through these. More recently, I've been working in the East Bay. And then, we have 34 sites in Marin, 20 sites in Sonoma, and 6 sites in Mendocino that have come to our attention for assessment. So here's the distribution on the North Coast. There's a cluster of sites down in Marin, some around Bodega Bay, up around Sea Ranch, and then up at Gualala and Point North. And in this photograph, there are 60 sites. That's a lot of sites to either keep track of or to assess. So we need to develop some methods for taking a look at these sites and deciding which ones are most important. Now, the single most important thing is, are there monarchs in the area? And that's been a real issue on the North Coast, where the monarchs have been few or far between, especially in Sonoma County in recent years or even recent decades. So just as an example, here's a photograph, aerial photo of one of the sites at Monarch Glen and Sea Ranch. See, there's a lot of trees around there, so the monarchs could be anywhere. But when we really see where they are, we zoom in, we see that they're clustered in this called Monarch Glen. It's like a gap in the forest that's surrounded by trees. And this provides a lot of wind shelter, but also lets a lot of light in. So this is kind of a classic monarch site where we have a gap in an otherwise dense forest. So the process we work through is we consult the Xerces Society database. And then, of course, there's the oral tradition that Mia brings that goes well before the Xerces database. That lets us know what's the historical occupancy pattern. Then we can ask ourselves, is the site recently occupied? That's the Thanksgiving counts are very valuable there, but there are sites that aren't monitored in Thanksgiving. You can do a visual examination from aerial photography, make sure that the grove is still there and it has enough depth to actually provide wind shelter, and then decide on a deeper analysis. And this is largely a matter of landowner interest and funding. And fortunately, in recent years, there's been a influx of funding for overwintering sites in California. And of course, a field visit is absolutely essential I can go into a site and come up with a first impression because I've seen almost every large site in California. Now, we have a new tool in the toolbox called LIDAR. It's basically laser scanning from an airplane and gives us this view from above. I've been using hemispherical photography, which is a method that gives us a view from below. And then we can use those to analyze wind and light. And what I'm always on the lookout for in a site is what I call the fatal flaw. It's like, is there some wind direction we're not protected from? Is it too dark? Is it too light? And then we come up with really solid recommendations based on the analysis. So I'm going to take you through a bit of this process. So we're going to look at these sites around Bodega Bay. There are 4 named monarch sites, recognized monarch sites around Bodega Bay. The largest site is this Bodega Dunes Campground, which is this site here, and then Ranch Road, which is a CDFW ecological reserve that was bought for monarch habitat back in the late 1990s. And according to MIA, in the 90s, there were about 50,000 monarchs that came to Ranch Road. Recently, there haven't been any. So I'm going to take a closer look at the Bodega Dunes Campground. This is a California state park bordered by Sonoma County Regional Park, so it's public land. The stand is primarily blue gum, eucalyptus, and Monterey cypress, and the last significant clustering was in 1997. There have been a few butterflies showing up since then, but with that order of magnitude drop in the California population, numbers in Sonoma County have really dropped off, so that they're few and far between. They're still there, but few and far between. So we're going to take a look more closely at this area in this orange circle, where we can see we have cypress trees, very distinctive canopy. We have the blue gum eucalyptus, another distinctive canopy. And then we have this alcove. Now, these alcoves are really pretty typical of monarch sites, which is an opening in the forest. You can see the campground facilities here, campground here. There's a picnic area, picnic bench in the alcove itself. So, our methods are, we do a lot of work in geographic information systems. We have LIDAR from the Sonoma VegMap project from 2013. We process that LIDAR to make a canopy model. Then we can run insolation or solar radiation for the 3 key months, October, November, December. And because the solar radiation is symmetrical around the winter solstice, that also accounts for January, February, and March. And we can break it down into morning, midday, and afternoon. Then we can run a program called Wind Ninja, look at wind exposure from 8 directions, and we can do the overlay. And then from below, we can incorporate the hemispherical photography. So let me just take you through some of the analysis here. Okay, so here's that alcove. This is the aerial photography. This is what the LIDAR looks like. Each of those points is a reflection, and they're color-coded by height above the ground. So the reds are high, the blue is the ground. We can separate out the canopy density. So we see where there are trees versus where there's ground. Then we can make really, really cool 3-dimensional views that are really great for trying, for presentations. But we want to get a little more analytical than just saying, oh, that's a really cool image there. So the first thing that's probably straightforward is do some solar radiation or insolation modeling. So going to be looking at December daily insolation. So here's the alcove. and we run a solar radiation model on the outer canopy surface. So all the stuff with LIDAR at this point is being done on the outer surface of the canopy. Now, this is okay because monarchs are usually somewhere close to the outer canopy surface. So we can see the blue areas are in the shade, the red areas are the really highly lit areas. We see that this alcove area has a mix of very well lit sites, some shade, and the ground is pretty exposed to radiation. So it's well lit, but there is heterogeneity. We can look and see in the morning that the east-facing side of the alcove is getting lit. The west-facing side still in the shade. At midday, we're getting light all around the alcove. And then in the afternoon, we get more solar radiation over here on the southwest-facing side, but we're still getting a lot of light here on the southeast-facing side. So this definitely has a good mix of solar radiation at the alcove that was the previous cluster site around here. So now we want to look at wind. This program that I use is called Wind Ninja. It models wind across surfaces. So we put in topography and it distributes a wind field across that. It's basically solving fluid dynamic equations. It was developed by the USDA Forest Service Fire Lab in Missoula, and it's used operationally on fire. So we know that it's proven its use. And what you do is you define a wind speed and direction, say, okay, wind is coming at 10 miles per hour out of the north. And this is the key assumption that I'm working with here. We're assuming a solid outer canopy surface. So it's really only good for relative exposure at the canopy, not within the canopy. But it does give us a good look at the sort of macro structure of the grove. And the monarchs are usually near the canopy surface, trying to seek out well-lit sites. And then, of course, you have to wear the right wardrobe to use Wind Ninja and be very quiet when you use it. So here's what some of the results look like. I have this arranged around the points of the compass. So here's northwest, north, northeast, east, southeast, south, southwest, and west. And then I took the maximum of all of these is in the middle. The scale goes from blue, which is very well wind sheltered, to red, which is very wind exposed. So if we look in the black circle, which is our alcove, we see we're very well sheltered from northwest winds. Pretty well sheltered from north winds. You see the blue spots in there. Pretty well all around from all of these different wind directions. So yes, we do have pretty good wind shelter. The maximum wind exposure is more moderate. And then we have a couple of other sites where monarchs have historically clustered, and you can see there's blue in most of those, except for this one down in the Ranch Road area. But the historical cluster sites in the campground area are relatively well protected from the wind. And they also are getting a fair amount of light. So the structure looks good there. If we look a little more closely at this maximum wind exposure, here's our alcove. There's definitely moderate wind exposure there from at least one direction. Now we can get strong winds from any direction when you look at the wind data from the local weather station. This site here is much better protected, probably because of the presence of this wind shelter belt over here. And then the site down here on Ranch Road, the outer canopy surface is very exposed to winds coming from the southeast, which is a very, very important storm direction. So we have to take a closer look there. So now we're going to dive underneath the canopy and talk about hemispherical photography. So it's an 8mm lens mounted on a gimbal so that self-levels the camera. It's oriented to north. Here's the compass that you use to orient it. And here I am dressed in overalls because this particular site here in Andrew Malaria State Park has a very dense understory of poison oak. Not the most pleasant environment to work in, but you got to go where you got to go. And then this technique was first published in Conservation Biology back in 1991. So it's has the imprint of peer-reviewed publication on it. So this is a fisheye photo. This happens to be taken at Ranch Road. We're looking directly overhead in the middle of the photograph. The edge of the image, the round edge, is the horizon, looking directly horizontally, so we can see out through that gap, see some trees well in the distance, and you get this pattern of gaps and foliage. Program I use called HemiView superimposes on a grid that has the different compass directions and different elevation angles or zenith angles. And it's basically counting up the number of pixels in each of these sectors that is sky versus obstruction. And adds those all up and comes up with sight factors. We can also superimpose on the sun paths. So sun rises over here in the east, and we can see here's the December sun path down here. So we can see that this site in December is getting kind of nice dappled light here in the late morning, a little bit more in the mid-afternoon, late afternoon. And then the sun gets higher in the sky as the season progresses, or gets lower in the sky as we move towards the winter solstice. So we come up with monthly values of solar radiation. We can also get a first order estimate of wind exposure based on the principle that the more open it is, the more wind is going to get in. So here we're looking at how open it is in the 8 different compass directions. So on this photograph, which happens to be right there in the alcove, to the north, it's very well sheltered. Only 2% of the sky is visible, 4%, 5%, getting a little more open, 14%, but it's up here at the higher elevation angles. Here from the south and the southwest, we have 42% and 46%. And again, it's mainly at the upper elevation angles. And then here directly due west, we have much more even distribution of open sky in different directions. So let's look at another site here. So this is farther south in the campground area. It's a site that's very open. So here we're getting really high values, 80%, 78%, 79%, very well sheltered from the east to north direction, and then intermediate in these 2 directions. One more site, this is that Ranch Road site again, which is, just a very heterogeneous canopy. So, 8%, 27% is the high here, 19, 11, 16, 11, 3% very well sheltered from that direction. So I just want to give you a sense of, what these numbers look like. So then when we plot out at all the different sites I took fisheye photos at here, I've made kind of a polar plot using some GIS voodoo where the length the size of the pin is proportional to the wind sight factors that I just showed you. And then I've highlighted the low values in blue here, and values that are generally too high are in the white. So up here, it looks like we may be getting a little too much wind up in the campground area. But then down here in Ranch Road, we have very well wind sheltered sites. So that's you know, an interesting look at the heterogeneity of this particular large site. And then, you know, we can kind of compare it to what's going on with the, from the LIDAR from above, and with the Wind Ninja. Now, what the Wind Ninja is telling us is that out at the canopy surface, this is very, very exposed to wind. But in the fisheye photography from below the canopy, it's very well sheltered from the wind. And it's not surprising that when the monarchs were clustering in here, they were deeper in the forest canopy. They weren't out at the exposure. And that our cluster site here has that moderate wind exposure in Wind Ninja, and has relatively high wind exposure from the fisheye photography. So I'm still at the point where I'm reconciling the two measurements to really figure out what's going on. So it's a work in progress. Now we're going to look at the light. This is just overall canopy openness, how much of the sky you can see. So I have this scale over here color coded, and virtually every monarch site in California is between about 0.15 and 0.3. So 15 to 30% of the sky is visible. So I have those in green, too dark is in blue, and too light is in yellow and white. So you see there's a fair number of sites in here that are in this acceptable zone. But all of the sites down here on Ranch Road are below the range we see in other monarch sites. Now we can look at the solar radiation in October, and we can see up here in our gap, we're getting a lot of light. That was true from the LIDAR analysis. And then as we're on the canopy edge here, we're getting high light levels. We go into the forest, it gets darker. And then down here on Ranch Road, we're not seeing very much direct light in October at all. There's a few spots that are a little lighter than others, but it's still pretty dark in there. So let's just do a quick comparison of the October insolation from the fisheye photos here with the points. And then here's what the LIDAR is telling us. So we can see down here in Ranch Road, there's a lot of very well lit areas, but there are gaps in the canopy, holes in the canopy, where we're not getting so much radiation on the surface. And then we can overlay the two of them and see that we're getting a somewhat different view from below the canopy, which is quite dark down here, and up at the edge of the canopy, upper surface, which is very light. So I want to talk about what the prescription for Ranch Road would be. We're still a work in progress, but the general conclusion is that it's too dark in this site. Now, everybody always wants to plant trees and make, but sometimes sites can get overgrown, and the monarchs don't stay around because they don't have enough light. So we have to be aware of that. So there's only one site in here that's within the range at other sites, and it's just marginally there. And most of the site is less than 15% of the sky visible. So our conclusion is that this site is currently too dark and it's overgrown. Remember, the last time monarchs were really clustering in this site was in the late 90s. So there's been 20 years of forest growth and filling in since then. Another issue we have in sites are hazard trees. Some trees have died and are snags and are hazards. So our prescription is roughly some selective thinning in the interior, so that here's 3 representative photos, that we open up the canopy a bit. Not a huge amount, but selectively take out some trees and open up the canopy so that we maintain the wind shelter, but we let more light into this site. So I think I'll stop there. I want to thank, the people who have contributed to these studies, the Xerces Society, California State Parks, the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts. I love RCDs, really unsung heroes of conservation in California. Funding has come from the Wildlife Conservation Board, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and a fair number of local sources. So I'm going to stop there, and I think it's time for questions.
Yes, thank you, Stu. That was hugely informative. And I know that I have a couple questions. Before we do go into Q&A, I do want to give a shout out to our Resource Conservation District co-hosts. I just wanted to mention that and encourage that folks reach out to their Resource Conservation District if anyone has questions about planning and implementing a local monarch conservation project. RCDs offer non-regulatory, confidential, and free assistance to their communities. So they're a great resource, and you can reach out to them through their staff pages on their websites, which you can see here on this slide. So Marin County has Marin RCD. Sonoma County has 2 RCDs, the Goldridge RCD and Sonoma RCD. Goldridge RCD serves a small portion of West County, so you'll want to check their district maps before reaching out and make sure you've got the right one. And then you can also reach out to folks in Mendocino County at the Mendocino County RCD. And with that, we can get into question and answers. And just a reminder to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And maybe at the end of Q&A, we can ask for folks to add to the chat some of their maybe observations in their local areas if you're seeing any monarchs. So, okay, I'll open the Q&A box. It looks like maybe we can start with the iNaturalist question. It looks like someone missed the answer to that. So the original question was, if you see monarchs and you want to report a sighting, what project should you tag on the iNaturalist app? And so Emma, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. The project is Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, kind of a mouthful, Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. And if you can also search for a project, so you can see other observations that have already been tagged, which can be kind of fun. And again, if you forget, we hope we'll find it, we'll probably find it, but that little extra step saves us some time. So we really appreciate it.
Great, thank you. And I would say from Xerces' end, if you could report sightings through the app first, that would be great. You can also report sightings on the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper website. That's primarily for monarchs on their journey to overwintering sites. But if you see monarchs clustering, then maybe reach out to Emma or I at Xerces or your regional Thanksgiving Count coordinator. You can view the regional coordinators at the Western Monarch Count website. You can also email monarchs@xerces.org if you have any general questions about monarchs, and Emma or I will probably get back to you. We are receiving a lot of questions during this time of year, so please be patient with us, but we will see your message and we'll respond at as early as we can. Okay, second question. Someone's saying that both blue gum eucalyptus and Monterey cypress are introduced non-native trees in Sonoma County. Do we know what native trees might have been used as a historic overwintering sites for the monarchs before these species were brought to the region? And they're guessing that old growth redwood forest would have provided the structure and composition necessary for providing the correct habitat requirements. So maybe if there's any comment there. Let's start with Stu. Do you have a?
Okay, yeah, that's one of the paradoxes of conserving Western monarchs is that we have to manage non-native trees. The monarchs made their choice over the last century or so, and I think we need to honor that and work with it. So the question of what was the ancestral condition of monarchs in California? Well, first, the major overwintering sites were probably on the Monterey Peninsula, where we had tens of thousands of acres of pine oak forest, native, and down near Cambria, where there still is a site where they're clustering in Monterey pines. In Southern California, they may have hunkered down in some of the riparian canyons. But there really aren't very many trees really close to the coast. When we get up into Sonoma County, we start seeing groves of Douglas fir coming close. So the site coming close to the coast, the site in Monarch Glen is a mix of cypress, but there's also native Douglas fir. There's a site near Stillwater Cove that actually is a Douglas fir, second growth Douglas fir redwood forest that is a little bit inland, but still has some monarchs. So the quick answer is there probably wasn't very much overwintering habitat on the North Coast that was suitable in the ancestral condition, but the monarchs are really opportunistic and they've taken advantage of that. I think, Emma may have some things and Mia may have some things to add to that, but, it's a real interesting conservation issue. It's very, very typical of some of the issues we're facing in the 21st century in a really, really changed world.
Thanks for that, Stu. Mia, I see that your hand's up. So if you would like to unmute yourself and share your thoughts, that would be wonderful.
One of the first sites that I saw that Stu was giving attention to was Andrew Molera. And in my other life, I'm a national park ranger and we support native habitat. And it was very reassuring to see Stu's methods identify the specific eucalyptus areas, not only the ones that monarchs were currently using, but that redundancy to make sure that the area was protected, because it allowed the state parks to then remove other eucalyptus. Instead of just saying all eucalyptus should be protected because of their potential value to eucalyptus, by using Stu's tools, we could make very selective strategic choices that benefit monarchs, but then help us as land managers move towards habitat restoration for native species. And another good example are what you're doing other places, Stu, to find that balance and give land managers those tools.
Thank you, Mia. Emma, did you have anything to add to that? No? Okay, perfect. So our next question by the same individual is, have any experimental forest thinning projects been attempted for monarch management? And if so, where? Do you think it would be interesting to compare potential thinning treatments within the grove along Ranch Road with a control area? Since the condition is somewhat homogeneous, it would be cool to observe the impacts of the treatment and the control side by side. Does anyone have thoughts on that?
So this idea of thinning forests is actually relatively new. People are very cautious about taking trees out. Sometimes the trees take themselves out, so that's always, but better to have your choice of which trees are going to be removed. So I'm currently involved in 2 projects where we have proposed thinning the forest out. One is at Point Pinole, which is in the East Bay near Richmond. And there's a large, dense eucalyptus forest where we're talking about cutting a 1/4 acre gap in the middle of it, more than 50 meters from the edge, so it maintains wind shelter. But that will open it up and create a really nice gap that hopefully the monarchs will like the light that's in there. The other site is at Andrew Malera State Park, where Mia just mentioned, where back in 2001, we did a fisheye photography survey and identified that the trees that were advancing into the riparian zone of the Big Sur River were not critical wind shelter, so they were able to take those out. But in the 20 years since we did that study, the grove has filled in and densified immensely to the point where the old cluster sites are just too dark now. They're not getting nearly enough light. But at the same time, the wind shelter around the edges has densified. So we have an opportunity to take out a lot of the small trees, the pole-sized trees up to maybe 6 inches diameter breast height within the interior and open it up again. So we're in the middle of kind of formalizing that with state parks. And so stay tuned on those projects. The idea, it's really hard to have like control sites, because every site is kind of, unique. So it's definitely a case where, we're hoping the old, if you build it, they'll come and stick around. That's the key, is to have them stick around. So the presence of some monarchs attracts other monarchs. And again, getting to this kind of crowdsourcing idea, so that if the site has nectar, has a good light gap, has wind shelter, the monarchs are just going to like it there and stay around. There'll be other monarchs around, so they'll know it's good. And then they'll attract the monarchs that are flying by. And that's how we get these aggregation sites. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty exciting because all the emphasis to date has been on planting more trees, but you can have a forest canopy that's just too dense for monarchs.
Do you mind if I highlight a couple of other things that Stu is doing that really impressed me? And it has to do with the site that was in my show, Rob Hill, because you have removed trees there and created alcoves, and you're also testing some other eucalyptus that might be a little bit easier to live with than blue gum. And it's a real exciting site, and it's a win-win because there's a endangered species nearby that Stu and the Presidio Trust needed to take into consideration. So to me, it's a really good model of trying some things that you are a proponent of, Stu, and seeing what happens in a very public setting.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about the Rob Hill alcove. That was a case where we had this really dense wall of foliage on the north side of a parking lot. And it was too exposed to wind whipping in from the west along the road. So we the Presidio took out the small trees up to about 6-inch DBH. The blue gums, we left the cypress in the forest behind. And it created a really beautiful, almost cathedral-like environment that was protected from the westerly winds. And at the same time, the eucalyptus that had been planted around the campground to the south have been growing like gangbusters. So they're finally going to be tall enough to create the wind shelter from the south. So now all we need is some monarchs to come and check it out. And hopefully we'll see a bounce back in the population in Northern California.
We saw our first 3 yesterday, Stu.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's great news, Mia. Yeah, we'll keep our fingers crossed. All right, we have another question in the Q&A. Is there an excess of overwintering sites for the needed growth of the monarch population, or is there more sites needed, or do more sites need to be created? If more need to be created, is there an idea of how much is needed for the population to rebound?
Well, I guess I'll take a whack at that, although I'm sure Emma and Mia can weigh in on this. At this point, I don't think the number of overwintering sites is limiting. I think it's the quality of the sites that's really important. That it's been like this total hands-off, almost accidental management or lack of management of these sites. And it's kind of like when a eucalyptus or when a forest, I tend to think of eucalyptus, when it gets large enough, you just by chance you end up with the right gap and wind shelter belt structure, and the monarchs find it. Now they'll leave sites when the conditions get too windy. So for example, even at a really high quality site like Monarch Grove Sanctuary in Pacific Grove, we had like a record windstorm in December 1995. It was like hurricane force winds all up and down the coast, and monarchs just got kind of blown out from the site and never came back. And that happens, especially early in the season when conditions are really mild. Then they can cluster almost anywhere and not be too wind exposed. But then we see that we get the first storms of the season. I mean, the storm we just had was rather exceptional, but then they start leaving sites that don't have the right wind shelter. And then they find the sites where the monarchs have stuck around because they're flying by and monarchs are there. So they're attracted to it. So they sort themselves out to essentially the same sites every year that are, providing the suitable microclimates. So, I think it's much more important at this point to work with what we have rather than trying to create new sites. Let's make sure that we're maintaining the quality of the existing sites, because the monarchs will find them and stick around.
Thanks, Stu. And I do want to clarify too, maybe we don't want to create new overwintering sites and we want to work with what we have, but in terms of creating habitat for breeding and nectar habitat, we do want to increase the amount of habitat we're creating. So Emma, I know you had something you wanted to share as well.
I think Stu answered that really well. I think that, we occasionally get folks who get excited about like planting trees, or monarchs have never been in their stand of trees and they're thinking about creating an opening. And I would just say that I'm sure Stu and Mia have a deeper history, but besides like maybe one site that Kingston Leon has worked on, I just don't think we have examples of that working. And it's a lot of work and takes a lot of time to plant a forest. And there's a lot we still don't know. Monarchs are really so mysterious in a lot of ways, and science can only get us so far about where they choose. So I think working with what we have is a big enough challenge, and we don't need to like create more sites. Obviously, if you're a private landowner and you want to do something on your property, this might be a more attractive option. But I think I just like to to say to people that we don't have evidence it works. So you can try, and it'd be great if you succeed. I just think it's a low chance of success and it might take a lot of time. So.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned Kingston Leon. He's done 2 gap creation projects. One near Los Osos and then one up on Napono Mesa. So, you know, there are some examples of that have worked.
That's great. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll do a last call for questions. We could maybe take one more, and then we'll wrap up the webinar at 10:30. So I'll give folks a second.
And Isis, I can be contributing something to this.
Oh yeah.
In the last few years, when there were so few monarchs, the challenge for us monitors was to go to sites that we might not have visited in a number of years because we had not seen monarchs, but maybe the growth conditions had improved being living trees. So we went to a number of sites and we had several very pleasant and notable surprises, like at Gill Tract and Richmond Field Station and Aquatic Park in the East Bay. And that was really an important message to me. And that's kind of my 25th Monarch Count challenge, and especially appropriate for the group who are listening today. You heard the numbers that are in Mendocino, Sonoma, and Marin. And that's my goal, is to work with you to try to check more of those historic sites, because they might have regained some value and they might be harboring some monarchs, especially in some of those difficult storm conditions, et cetera. So that was really a good lesson to take another look and not give up.
That's a great reminder, Mia. And I'll just reiterate to folks in the attendance who may not be familiar with the Western Monarch Count website, but you can view overwintering sites there through an interactive map. So if you go to that, westernmonarchcount.org, you can search your area and find nearby sites to go visit. And so now would be a great time to start heading out through November. You might meet up with some local volunteers or regional coordinators. And again, that information can also be found on that same website. And since we don't have any other questions, I'll just go over some final wrap-ups. So we'll conclude the webinar here. A big thank you to our incredible speakers. I appreciate all of you and everyone in attendance today. This webinar has been recorded and it will be available on the Xerces YouTube later this week or early next. So if you'd like to review some of the content, please feel free to do that. And if you have any remaining questions, you can follow up again with your local RCDs in Marin, Sonoma, and Mendocino County, or you can email Emma or I at monarchs@xerces.org. Thank you all.